She walked toward the man who had murdered her family. He held a detonator in his trembling hand. One press, and the entire ship would be gone. Every guard in the chamber screamed for her to stop. She did not stop. She reached out and placed her hand over his, gently, the way you might take the hand of a frightened child. And she said two words that broke him more completely than any army ever could. Let it go. But to understand how an alien queen learned mercy from a human boy and 3 apples, you have to go back to the beginning. The first sign that something was terribly wrong was the way the stars outside the window were not moving the way stars were supposed to move. Declan Hollis noticed it while half asleep, his cheek pressed against cold glass that should not have existed in his apartment in Prescott, Arizona. He had gone to bed at 11:30 after microwaving leftover pasta and watching the tail end of a baseball game he did not care about. Now he was looking at the silent ocean of space, drifting past an enormous observation window that stretched wider than his entire apartment building. Except the stars were not drifting. They were sliding in perfect geometric patterns like pieces on a cosmic chessboard. Vast clusters of light repositioned themselves as though guided by invisible hands. Enormous metallic structures floated among them, too large to be ships and too deliberate to be asteroids. They moved like silent architects rearranging the galaxy itself. Declan blinked several times. He pressed his palm flat against the glass. It was real. Cold and smooth and undeniably solid beneath his fingers. He sat back slowly and looked around the chamber. It was wide and circular, built from some dark crystalline metal that pulsed faintly with rivers of pale light running through its walls like veins. The air smelled clean, almost too clean, like the inside of a hospital that had never known sickness. Okay, Declan muttered to himself. Either I am dreaming dead or someone just abducted me across the galaxy. A soft chime answered him. He turned slowly. 2 tall figures stood at the entrance of the observation chamber. They looked almost human at first glance. Tall, elegant, wrapped in smooth armor that appeared grown rather than built. Their skin carried a faint pearlescent glow and their eyes shone with soft blue light that shifted slightly when they moved. Their ears were longer than human ears, tapering gracefully backward along their skulls, like something between sculpture and biology. One of them tilted its head at Declan. Subject is conscious, it said in perfectly clear English, though its voice carried a faint harmonic echo, as if 2 voices were speaking in near-perfect unison. Declan raised one finger. Before we continue, he said carefully, I would like to confirm something. The 2 alien soldiers exchanged a brief glance. Yes, the taller one replied. Declan gestured vaguely toward the stars, the ship, and the general situation surrounding him. I am not on Earth anymore, am I? There was a pause. No, Declan exhaled slowly and leaned back in the chair. That is mildly concerning. The alien stared at him. One of them tapped a glowing panel on its wrist. Psychological state appears stable, it murmured to the other. Remarkably stable, the second one confirmed. Declan pointed at both of them. I can hear you, by the way. That seemed to genuinely surprise them. The shorter one studied him more closely, its glowing eyes narrowing with something that looked almost like professional curiosity. You are unusually calm for your species. Declan shrugged. Look, if you wanted me dead, I would already be dead. And if this is some kind of galactic kidnapping, panicking probably will not help my case. The 2 soldiers stared at him for several long seconds. Then the taller one gave a small, approving nod. Logical. Thanks, Declan said. I try. Silence settled between them. Through the observation window, the impossible geometry of the stars continued its slow, deliberate rearrangement. Declan watched it for a moment. Somewhere deep in his chest, beneath the calm exterior, something old stirred. Something that remembered a night 15 years ago, when a girl with glowing eyes had pointed at the sky and whispered the true names of constellations no human had ever charted. He pushed the memory down. Not yet. Not here. Not surrounded by alien soldiers on a ship that should not exist, traveling through a galaxy that he had spent his entire life looking at from the wrong side of a telescope. All right, he said, gesturing around the chamber. Next question. Why me? The atmosphere shifted immediately. The 2 aliens stiffened. Not in aggression, in discomfort. The taller one finally answered. You were requested. Declan blinked. Requested. Yes. By who? Neither alien spoke. Instead, the chamber door behind them slid open with a deep, resonant hum that Declan felt in his ribs. Both soldiers turned and stepped aside with the precise discipline of beings who had been trained since birth to obey without hesitation. The corridor beyond stretched far into the distance. Its walls were formed from the same dark crystalline metal, glowing faintly with flowing currents of light that moved like slow rivers through the syringe. Tall figures moved through it. Dozens of aliens, most similar in appearance to the soldiers, going about their duties aboard what Declan was beginning to understand was not just a ship, but something closer to a floating city. Every single one of them slowed when they saw him. Some stared openly, their luminous eyes widening. Others whispered to one another in soft alien tones that Declan could not quite catch. A tall, noble-looking figure with golden markings across his luminous skin stopped walking entirely. He stared at Declan the way someone might stare at a myth that had just stepped out of a storybook and into the hallway. "That is him," the noble whispered to one of the guards. The guard gave a stiff nod. The noble's glowing eyes widened. "Incredible." Declan pointed at himself. "Okay, now I am officially uncomfortable." No one laughed. The soldiers gestured for him to move forward. "It is time," the taller one said. "For what?" They did not answer. As Declan stepped into the corridor, the full scale of the vessel became impossible to ignore. The ceiling towered nearly 50 meters overhead, lined with drifting holographic constellations that shifted and pulsed as though tracking the real stars beyond the hull. Transparent bridges crossed the vast chamber at different levels, connecting sections of the ship that seemed to serve entirely different purposes. One bridge led toward what appeared to be a massive botanical garden filled with plants that glowed in colors Declan had no names for. Another connected to a tier of observation platforms where groups of Varanthi stood watching data streams flow through holographic displays the size of billboards. Floating drones moved silently through the air, like mechanical birds, keeping watch over an empire in transit. Some carried small cargo containers. Others projected scanning beams that swept across the corridor in regular intervals, cataloging everything they touched. The technology surrounding him was so far beyond anything on Earth that Declan found himself unable to even estimate the gap. It was not decades ahead. It was not centuries. It was something else entirely, a different branch of understanding that had grown from roots he could not even identify. The ship hummed, not loudly but constantly, a deep vibration that lived in the floor and the walls and the air itself. It felt less like a machine and more like an organism, a living thing carrying thousands of beings through the void between stars with the steady patience of a whale moving through deep water. And everywhere Declan looked, aliens were watching him. Whispers followed him like a tide. "That is the human. He looks so ordinary. Are we certain?" The Queen confirmed it herself. That last sentence made Declan stop walking. The guards gently urged him forward, but his mind had already locked onto one word. "Queen." He looked at the guard beside him. "Hold on. Yes, did someone just say Queen?" The alien hesitated for half a second. "Yes." Declan rubbed the back of his neck. "Right. Just hypothetically speaking." The guard waited. "If a queen wanted to meet someone," Declan continued, "why abduct them in the middle of the night and drag them across the galaxy instead of sending a polite message first?" The shorter guard actually seemed to consider this. "That is outside my authority." Figures. They continued walking. The deeper they moved into the ship, the stranger the reactions became. Some aliens bowed their heads slightly as Declan passed. Others stared with open curiosity mixed with something he could not quite name. One small, pale-skinned alien child, peeking from behind a tall, noble, gasped quietly. "That is the human she spoke about." Declan caught that. He frowned but said nothing. His heart was beating faster now, though he kept his face carefully neutral. 15 years was a long time. Long enough to convince yourself that a childhood memory was just that, a memory. A strange dream about a strange girl who appeared behind your grandparents' house in the Arizona desert and vanished 3 weeks later without explanation. Long enough to almost believe she had never been real at all. Almost. The soldiers finally stopped before a set of enormous doors. They were easily 20 meters tall, covered in flowing alien script that shimmered like liquid gold. Two towering guards stood on either side, holding spears made of concentrated light. The moment Declan approached, both guards lowered their heads, not to the soldiers, to him. Declan slowly looked behind himself. Nope, he murmured. Still just me. The tall soldier stepped forward. The audience chamber awaits. Declan's stomach tightened. Let me guess. The queen is inside. Yes, and she specifically asked for me. Yes. There was a long silence. Then Declan exhaled slowly through his nose. All right, he said quietly. I really hope this is not about that time I accidentally befriended an alien girl when I was 10. The two soldiers froze. For the first time since Declan had met them, genuine shock crossed their glowing faces. The tall one slowly turned toward him. His voice dropped. You remember? Declan stared at them. Wait, why are you reacting like that? Neither guard answered. Instead, the massive doors began to open. A deep wave of light spilled into the corridor like liquid dawn, warm and golden, and almost alive. The sound that accompanied it was low and resonant, like a cathedral bell struck once and left to hum. And somewhere beyond those doors, across the vast throne chamber of an alien empire, a queen was waiting. The throne room was so vast that for a moment Declan thought he had stepped into open space. The ceiling arched hundreds of meters overhead, like the inside of a hollow moon, threaded with flowing rivers of pale light that moved slowly through the structure as if the building itself were breathing. Massive columns of dark crystalline metal rose from the polished floor like frozen lightning bolts, each one carved with alien script that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. Between the columns stood rows of alien figures, nobles, officers, diplomats, beings from worlds that Declan had never imagined and could not have named if his life depended on it. They were arranged in a hierarchy that was evident even to someone with no understanding of Aranthi's social structure. The tallest and most elaborately dressed stood nearest the throne. Their robes shimmered with patterns that moved like living things, and the ridges along their temples were more pronounced than those of the common soldiers. Behind them stood lesser nobles in simpler attire, and behind those stood military officers in polished armor, and behind those stood diplomatic envoys from what appeared to be entirely different alien species, beings with skin of deep green and amber and pale violet, some with 4 arms, some with eyes that took up half their faces, some that appeared to hover slightly above the ground. Every single one of them turned to look at him. The sound of the doors closing behind him echoed through the chamber like distant thunder rolling across an empty desert. The air itself felt heavier here, charged with the accumulated weight of centuries of power and ceremony and decisions that had shaped the fate of billions. Declan stood there for a long second, hands in his jacket pockets, shoulders slightly hunched. He looked like a man who had accidentally wandered into the most intimidating, formal event in the history of the universe while wearing yesterday's clothes. Okay, he murmured to himself. Definitely not Kansas. The two soldiers escorting him stepped forward with mechanical precision. The room grew quieter. Whispers passed through the assembled court like wind moving through tall grass. That is him, the human. He is smaller than I expected. He looks harmless. That cannot possibly be the one Her Majesty searched for. Declan scratched the side of his head. I can hear all of you, you know. A few of the nobles actually looked embarrassed. Others did not look embarrassed at all. At the far end of the enormous chamber rose a wide staircase built from polished black stone that seemed to drink in the surrounding light. Each step was smooth and flawless, leading upward to a throne carved from a single massive piece of luminous crystal. The crystal pulsed faintly slowly like captured starlight breathing, and sitting upon it was the most striking person Declan had ever seen. She looked almost human. Almost. Her posture was regal and composed, the kind of stillness that commanded attention not through force, but through absolute certainty of self. Her skin shimmered faintly with a soft, silvery tone, as if moonlight lived just beneath the surface. Long, dark hair fell over one shoulder like liquid shadow. Delicate, elongated ears curved gracefully back from her head, but it was her eyes that stopped him cold. They glowed softly. Silver. The exact same shade of silver that had haunted his memory for 15 years. The same silver that had looked at him from behind his grandparents' garden wall on a warm September evening in Arizona, wide with fear and wonder and hunger and something else that a 10-year-old boy had not yet had the vocabulary to name. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The court waited. 1,000 aliens held their breath. Then the queen stood. The movement was graceful and effortless, and immediately the entire chamber bowed. Hundreds of alien nobles lowered their heads in perfect synchronization, like a field of tall grass bending under a single wind. Everyone except Declan. He looked around. "Oh," he whispered. Then he attempted an awkward half-bow that looked more like a man trying to pick up a dropped coin. A few quiet murmurs rippled through the court. The queen began descending the staircase. Each step was measured and deliberate, and with each one the tension in the chamber tightened, like a wire being drawn between two immovable points. Declan noticed something strange. The alien nobles were not watching their queen. They were watching him, as if they were waiting for something to happen that they had only ever heard about in stories. She reached the bottom of the stairs. Now only a few meters separated them. Up close, the resemblance to the girl from his childhood was undeniable. Same luminous gaze, same curious tilt of the head, slight and almost unconscious. Same faint ghost of a smile that appeared when she was studying something that interested her. But the small, slightly awkward girl he remembered had been replaced by someone powerful. Someone who carried the weight of an empire in the way she stood, in the straightness of her spine and the quiet authority of every breath she took. Declan raised one hand in an uncertain little wave. "Hi." Several nobles gasped softly. One of them whispered sharply to another, "He greets the sovereign like a friend." Another murmured back, "He has no sense of protocol." Declan glanced at them. "In my defense, nobody gave me a handbook." The queen's lips twitched. Just slightly, just barely. And that tiny movement sent visible shock through several members of the court. Two nobles exchanged wide-eyed looks. A guard near the staircase gripped his spear a little tighter, as though the natural order of things had just been gently but undeniably disturbed. She stepped closer. Now they were only an arm's length apart. For a long moment she simply looked at him. Not like a ruler examining a subject, more like someone searching for something they had lost so long ago that they had almost stopped believing it still existed. Declan shifted under her gaze. "You are staring." Another ripple of scandalized whispers moved through the court. The queen ignored them entirely. Her voice when she finally spoke was calm but softer than the vast chamber seemed to deserve, as though the words were not meant for the thousand watching nobles, but only for the one person standing in front of her. "You grew taller." Declan blinked. "Well," he said slowly, "that tends to happen over the course of 15 years. The queen studied his face carefully, the pale light in her eyes shimmering with something that was not quite amusement and not quite sadness, but lived somewhere in the territory between the two. "You remember," Declan let out a breath. "I mean, it is not every day a girl with glowing eyes shows up behind your house and asks if earth apples are poisonous." Several nearby nobles exchanged confused looks. One whispered, "Apples," another replied quietly. "Is that some form of human ritual?" Declan noticed them. "They're fruit," he clarified. And then the queen laughed. It was not loud. It was barely more than a breath-given shape, but it was unmistakably, undeniably a laugh. The entire throne room went silent. Several nobles looked at each other as though they had just witnessed something that broke a fundamental law of the universe. One elderly diplomat's mouth fell slightly open. A young officer near the door blinked rapidly, as if trying to clear a malfunction in her own perception. "Did she just?" someone whispered. "I have never heard," another began. In court, a third finished, sounding slightly dazed. The queen slowly shook her head, the faint smile still lingering on her face like the last light of a sunset that refused to fully disappear. "You gave me 3. 3 what?" "Apples." Declan snapped his fingers. "Oh yeah, because you said your species might explode if you ate unfamiliar plants." A pause. "Reasonable precaution," she replied. Declan nodded. I respected the caution. They stood there for another moment, studying each other across a distance that was measured not in meters, but in years. Then Declan tilted his head. "So," he said, "you are a queen now, yes. And this whole galaxy-spanning alien empire thing?" "Yes. And you kidnapped me." A faint murmur rippled through the nobles. The queen looked almost amused. "I retrieved you. Kidnapped feels more accurate." She stepped one pace closer. The court visibly tensed. Up on the balcony levels, several armored guards adjusted their stances. Declan did not notice. He was too busy studying the face of someone he had once known as a frightened girl who did not understand rain. "You disappeared," he said. The humor had left his voice now. What remained was something quieter, something that had waited 15 years to be spoken aloud. You never explained why? No, that was kind of rude. A few nobles gasped, but the queen's expression did not harden, it softened. The composure that she wore like armor developed a hairline crack barely visible, but Declan saw it because he had once seen the same crack on the face of a 10-year-old girl sitting under a mesquite tree in the Arizona desert, trying very hard not to cry. I was taken from Earth that night, she said. Her voice was quiet, but in the vast silence of the throne room, every syllable carried. The court listened. I was not meant to remain there, she continued. I was hiding. The words sent a current of tension through the assembled nobles. Several shifted uncomfortably. Others lowered their eyes. Declan frowned. Hiding? From what? The queen held his gaze, and then she told them. She told the court about the civil war that had torn the empire apart before she was born, about the assassinations that had gutted the royal bloodline one by one, about the desperate night when her last guardian, a woman named Thessara, who had served the royal family for 40 years, had taken a child princess and fled across the galaxy to a small, unremarkable planet orbiting a yellow star in a quiet arm of the Milky Way. She told them about 3 weeks of hiding in the Arizona desert, about the dry heat and the endless sky and the strange silence of a world that had no idea it was harboring a fugitive princess, about the first night when she had crouched behind a garden wall in the dark, hungry and terrified, and certain that every shadow held another assassin, and about the boy. He was 10 years old, she said. He came around the corner of his grandparents' house carrying a flashlight and a jar he was using to collect beetles. He saw me crouching in the dirt with my eyes glowing in the dark, and he did not scream. He did not run. He did not call for help. She paused. The throne room was utterly still. He looked at my eyes, she continued, and said, cool. Then he asked if I was hungry. I did not answer. He sat down on the other side of the wall and said that if I was some kind of alien, I should know that Earth food was pretty good and that his grandmother made the best apple pie in Prescott. Then he held an apple over the wall without looking. A murmur passed through the court. Seraphine ignored it. I took the apple, she said. I asked him if it was poisonous. He said he did not think so, but that he had never really checked. Then he laughed. Her voice softened. For the next 3 weeks, he came back every evening. He brought food. He brought a blanket when the nights grew cold. He taught me the names of the constellations as humans saw them, and I taught him the true names, the ones my people had charted thousands of years before his species learned to look up. He showed me insects and explained rain, and told me about a place called school where human children were apparently imprisoned for most of the day and forced to learn mathematics. Several nobles exchanged bewildered glances. One whispered to another, mathematics. He never asked me what I was. Seraphine continued. He never asked where I came from. He never asked why my eyes glowed, or why my ears were different, or why I flinched at every loud sound. He simply treated me as though I belonged there, as though a strange girl hiding behind a garden wall was the most normal thing in the world. She looked at Declan across the vast chamber. And one evening, sitting under a mesquite tree while the sun went down over the desert, he said something that changed the course of my life. He said that if people kept fighting over who deserved power, they would eventually destroy everything they were trying to rule. She paused. He was 10, she repeated. He was talking about a disagreement between 2 boys at his school over who should be captain of a kickball team. He had no idea that his words would echo inside the mind of a girl who would one day rule an empire. But they did. They echoed for 15 years, and they echo still. And then she told them about the night it ended. The assassin found us, she said. Her voice did not waver, but something in the glow behind her irises darkened. Thessara fought him at the perimeter of the safe house. She killed him. But there was a second one. The throne room was utterly silent now. The second assassin reached me before Thessara could return, the queen continued. I was 10 years old. I had no training, no weapon, no understanding of the power that ran in my blood. She paused. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper, but it filled the enormous chamber like smoke fills a room. I killed him. The silence that followed was so complete that Declan could hear the faint hum of the light currents flowing through the walls. My energy awakened in that moment, Seraphine said. The royal bloodline power that I had never been taught to use. It erupted out of me in a single burst, and it stopped his heart where he stood. He was dead before he hit the ground. She looked at Declan. I was 10 years old, she repeated, and that was the night I learned what I was capable of. The Sara pulled me from Earth before dawn. You were asleep. I never had the chance to say goodbye. Declan stood very still. The man who had joked his way through an alien abduction in a royal audience was gone now. In his place was someone looking at a woman he had once known as a scared girl and realizing the true weight of what she had survived. He did not speak. He did not need to. His silence said enough. But the chamber was not silent for long. From the ranks of the nobles, a tall figure in golden robes stepped forward. Lord Valdres moved with the practiced grace of someone who had navigated the politics of empire for decades. His robes shimmered with elaborate patterns. Faint ridges along his temples marked him as a member of the highest-ranking noble lineage. Your Majesty, he said. His voice was calm, measured, and edged with the precision of a blade hidden inside silk. A deeply moving account. But the court must address the practical matter before us. Seraphine's gaze shifted to him. The warmth that had been in her expression moments before cooled by several degrees. Valdres continued gesturing toward Declan with one long, elegant hand. This human is an unknown factor, an outsider. The empire faces fragile political balance. Rival houses question your authority even now. To bring a primitive species into the heart of the imperial court because of childhood sentiment is with the deepest respect an act that invites instability. Several nobles nodded, others watched carefully, measuring the winds. Declan raised his hand. Just to clarify, he said, I also do not understand why I am here. Valdres looked at him with the particular kind of coldness reserved for things found on the bottom of expensive shoes. That is precisely the concern. Declan shrugged. Fair. Valdres turned back to the Queen. Your Majesty, if the rumors are true that you spent years searching the galaxy for this individual, then the court deserves an explanation that extends beyond personal history. The room waited. Before Seraphine could respond, a voice rose from the far side of the chamber. It was thin with age, but carried the particular authority that belongs to someone who has outlived every person who once tried to silence them. Elder Oren stepped forward slowly. His skin was pale blue, faded with decades of service. His eyes were dim, but sharp. He had served the royal family before Seraphine was born, before the Civil War, before the assassinations. He was the last living connection to the empire that had existed before everything burned. He bowed to the Queen. Then he turned to face Valdres. Lord Valdres speaks of stability, Oren said. His voice was quiet, but in the silence of the throne room it carried like a bell. He speaks of protecting the empire from unknown factors. This is admirable. So perhaps the court would benefit from examining all unknown factors. Valdres's expression flickered. What are you implying, Elder? Oren did not blink. 15 years ago, on the night the royal family was assassinated, the Imperial Communication Array was under the direct authority of a single member of the High Council. Every distress signal sent by the Queen's guardians that night was intercepted and blocked. Not by the rebels. By someone inside the system. The chamber trembled with sudden whispered shock. Oren continued, his aged voice steady as stone. The individual who controlled that communication array has never been formally investigated. He has in fact risen to considerable political prominence in the years since. Oren did not look at Valdres. He did not need to. Every eye in the throne room made the connection on its own. Valdres's composure held but barely. His jaw tightened. His hands clasped behind his back pressed harder against each other. These are baseless accusations from a senile relic, he said sharply. I demand proof. Seraphine spoke. Her voice was not loud. She did not raise it. She did not need to. When the Queen of the Varanthi Empire spoke in that tone, the atoms in the air seemed to rearrange themselves out of respect. There will be proof, she said. I am ordering a formal investigation into the events of that night. Full access to the communication archives. Full testimony from surviving personnel. The investigation will be conducted publicly before the court with complete transparency. She looked at Valdres. And Lord Valdres will remain at court for its duration. As a valued member of the High Council, I am certain he welcomes the opportunity to clear his name. It was a trap, and every politically intelligent being in the room knew it. She was not accusing him. She was doing something far more dangerous. She was giving him the freedom to act, knowing that a guilty man with freedom will eventually reveal himself. Valdres stared at her for a long, taut moment. Then he bowed stiffly and stepped back into the ranks of the nobles without another word. The court exhaled. Seraphine turned back to the assembled nobles. She stood taller now. The vulnerability she had shown moments earlier was gone, folded away beneath the unyielding composure of a woman who had spent 15 years fighting for the right to stand exactly where she was standing. "This audience is concluded," she said. The court began to disperse, but the whispers that followed were different now. They carried the electric charge of something shifting beneath the surface of the empire. And through it all, Declan Hollis stood in the center of the throne room, arms crossed loosely, watching the queen of an alien civilization navigate a political chess game that would have made the most seasoned diplomat on Earth weep with inadequacy. He said nothing. He was beginning to understand that his role here was not to solve anything. It was to witness. Later that night, or what passed for night aboard a vessel that traveled between stars, Seraphine found him in the observation chamber where he had first woken up. He was sitting in the same chair watching the geometric dance of the stars through the enormous window. She entered without escort. No guards, no ceremony. She wore simpler clothing now, the royal armor replaced by something softer, darker, less like a uniform and more like a second skin. Without the throne and the court and the weight of 1,000 watching eyes, she looked smaller. Not weak, never weak, but closer to the girl he remembered. She stood beside the window for a long time without speaking. Declan did not push. He had learned a long time ago back in Prescott, back in the quiet years after his grandparents passed, and he found himself alone in a world that seemed to have no particular use for him, that sometimes the most important thing you could do for another person was simply to be present without demanding anything in return. 15 years, Seraphine said at last. Her voice was stripped of its royal authority. What remained was raw and tired and honest in a way that the throne room would never allow. 15 years I have not spoken the truth to anyone. Declan looked at her. Every word I say is measured, she continued. Every gesture is watched. Every decision is analyzed by 100 noble houses looking for weakness. She paused. I won in the end. I took back the throne. I rebuilt what was broken. But the cost of it, Declan. She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. Declan was quiet for a moment. Then he said simply, "Then do not talk to the queen. Talk to me." Seraphine turned to look at him. The pale shimmer in her gaze caught the starlight. And for just a moment, the mask fell away completely. Not the mask of a ruler, the mask of a survivor. The mask of a girl who had killed a man at 10 years old and had spent every day since then building herself into someone strong enough to make sure she would never be that helpless again. She looked at Declan Hollis, office worker from Prescott, Arizona, a man with no army, no title, no power, no relevance to the political machinery of a galactic empire. And she saw the only person in the universe who had ever looked at her and seen just a girl. "There are things I have not told the court," she said quietly, "about why I brought you here. It is more than memory, more than sentiment." Declan waited, but Seraphine shook her head. "Not tonight. Tonight I just need someone to sit with me who does not want anything from me." Declan nodded. He settled back in his chair. He looked out at the impossible stars. "I can do that," he said. And so they sat together in the observation chamber of a ship that carried the hopes of an empire, two people who had once been children sharing apples under an Arizona sky, separated by 15 years, and 100 billion miles reunited by something that neither thrones nor wars, nor the vast indifferent darkness of space had managed to destroy. Outside the window, the stars continued their slow geometric dance, and somewhere in the corridors of the imperial vessel, Lord Valdres stood alone in his quarters, staring at a sealed communication device he had not used in 15 years. His hands were trembling. The days that followed were among the strangest of Declan Hollis's life, and given that his life now included being abducted by aliens and standing in the throne room of a galactic queen, that was saying something. He was given quarters aboard the imperial vessel. They were large by any reasonable standard, with curved walls of that same dark crystalline metal, and a window that looked out onto a constantly shifting field of stars. The bed was wider than any bed he had ever owned and softer than anything he thought physically possible. A small table held a tray of food that appeared each morning without explanation. Dishes he could not name, but that tasted remarkably like someone had studied every comfort food on Earth and then rebuilt them from alien ingredients with 90% accuracy. He was comfortable. He was also, in every meaningful sense, a prisoner inside a palace. Commander Thelen was assigned as his escort. She was tall, even by Varanthi standards, with close-cropped silver hair and eyes that glowed a deeper blue than the common soldiers. She moved with the controlled precision of someone who had been forged in violence and had chosen discipline as the only acceptable alternative. She spoke rarely, and when she did, her words were stripped of everything unnecessary like a blade with no handle. "You are to remain in the designated corridors," she told him on the first morning. "The observation deck, the garden terrace, and the eastern gallery are accessible. All other areas require escort." Declan nodded. "And if I wander?" Thelen looked at him without expression. "You will not wander." He did not wander. But he watched. From the observation deck, from the garden terrace with its impossible alien plants growing under artificial starlight, from the eastern gallery, where holographic murals depicted the history of the Varanthi Empire in flowing light, Declan watched the political machinery of an alien civilization grind forward. And at the center of that machinery, driving every gear, stood Seraphine. She was everywhere. In the morning, she held council with her military advisors, reviewing intelligence reports from the Empire's borders, where pirate factions had been growing bolder in recent months. Declan sometimes caught glimpses of her through open doorways, standing at the head of a long table covered in holographic star maps, her gaze tracing fleet positions and supply lines with the focus of someone who understood that a single miscalculation could cost thousands of lives. In the afternoon, she received delegations from subject worlds, trade disputes, resource allocations, territorial complaints, the endless grinding minutiae of holding a civilization together across hundreds of star systems. She listened more than she spoke, and when she did speak, her words were precise and final. Declan noticed that she never raised her voice. She never needed to. In the evenings, she met with the noble houses, and that was where the real war was being fought. Declan watched it from the margins. He was learning to read the subtle language of Varanthi politics, the way a slight tilt of the head indicated disagreement, the way a noble's luminous skin would brighten or dim with emotion that their controlled expressions tried to hide. He noticed that Seraphine adjusted her approach for every interaction. With the military, she was direct and precise. With the diplomats, she was patient and measured. With the noble houses, she was something else entirely, a performer who knew exactly how much strength to show and how much vulnerability to reveal, and whose calculation of that balance was so perfect that it appeared effortless. He noticed other things too, the way her posture never fully relaxed even when she thought no one was watching. The way she ate alone, quickly, efficiently, as though meals were tasks to be completed rather than moments to be enjoyed. The way her quarters, which Thelen had briefly shown him on the first day, were immaculate and impersonal, containing nothing that suggested a life beyond duty. No art on the walls, no personal belongings, no evidence that anyone actually lived there rather than simply occupied the space between obligations. Seraphine had built herself into the perfect ruler, and in doing so she had erased almost everything else. The investigation into the communication archives had begun. Oren oversaw it personally, his aged hands moving through holographic records with the patience of a man who understood that truth was not a thing you seized, but a thing you excavated layer by careful layer. The surviving personnel from 15 years ago were being located and summoned. Some had scattered across the empire, others had disappeared entirely. 2 had been found dead under circumstances that Thelen described as statistically improbable. A phrase that Declan understood was the Varanthi military's way of saying murdered. And through it all, the whispers of Lord Valduris's faction grew louder. The queen is distracted. She is wasting resources on a human. The empire needs strength, not sentiment. Declan heard the whispers. He heard them in the corridors, in the garden terrace, in the careful silences that fell whenever he entered a room. The alien nobles were not subtle about their disdain. Some of them simply ignored him, which was tolerable. Others looked at him the way a person might look at a stain on an expensive garment, with polite confusion about how it got there, and quiet confidence that it would soon be removed. He did not take it personally. He understood something that the nobles did not seem to grasp. He was not here because he mattered. He was here because Seraphine needed someone who did not want anything from her, and in an empire of 1,000 scheming noble houses, that made him the rarest commodity in the galaxy. On the 4th night, Declan was standing in the garden terrace, watching a cluster of bioluminescent flowers slowly open their petals under the artificial starlight. The plants were unlike anything on Earth. Their stems were translucent, threaded with the same pale veins of light that ran through the ship's walls, and their blossoms pulsed gently in rhythms that seemed almost deliberate, as though the flowers were breathing in time with some deeper heartbeat of the vessel itself. He heard her footsteps before he saw her. Seraphine appeared at the far end of the terrace, still wearing the formal robe she had worn during the evening council session. She had not changed. She had not gone to her quarters first. She had come straight here, and that told Declan more about her state of mind than any words could have. She stopped a few paces away and looked at the flowers. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "The border situation is deteriorating," she said finally. Her voice was measured but carried an undercurrent of strain that the throne room would never have been allowed to hear. "Pirate factions have been raiding supply convoys along the Tesserine corridor for months. My advisors believe it is opportunistic, disorganized. But you do not," Declan said. Seraphine shook her head slowly. "The raids are too coordinated, too precisely targeted. Someone is feeding them information about our supply routes." She turned to face him, the faint glow of the alien flowers casting pale light across her features. "I convened the military council this morning. I am deploying the Third Fleet to the Tesserine corridor to secure the border and eliminate the pirate bases." Declan studied her face. There was something she was not saying. He could see it in the slight tension around her eyes, the way her fingers pressed against the stone railing of the terrace. "You think Valdris is involved?" he said. Seraphine was quiet for a moment. "I think Valdris has had 15 years to embed his people in every branch of the imperial infrastructure. Military intelligence, communications." She paused. "But I cannot prove it yet. And until I can, I must act as though the Empire's systems are trustworthy, even when I know they are not." Declan leaned against the railing beside her. "That sounds exhausting." Seraphine almost smiled. "It is." Silence settled between them again. One of the bioluminescent flowers near Declan's elbow slowly rotated its blossom towards Seraphine, as though drawn to her presence. She noticed and touched it gently with one fingertip. The flower pulsed brighter for a moment, then settled back into its rhythm. "Can I ask you something?" Declan said. "Yes. When we were kids, that last week before you disappeared, you told me you were afraid of something, but you would not say what it was." He looked at her. "I always wondered about that." The light in Seraphine's expression dimmed slightly, not in color but in some quality that seemed connected to something deeper than biology. "I was afraid of becoming what they wanted me to become." She said. "Who?" "Everyone. The court, the generals, the noble houses. They all had a version of me that served their purposes. A puppet queen, a symbol, a weapon." She looked at her hands. "On Earth, sitting under that tree with you, I was just a girl who did not understand rain. That was the only time in my life I was allowed to simply exist." Declan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You asked me once why people are kind to strangers. Do you remember what I said?" Seraphine looked at him. "You said because it does not cost anything." "Yeah," he paused. "But I think I was wrong about that. I think it does cost something. I think it cost you the wall you built to protect yourself, and that is terrifying." Seraphine held his gaze for a long time. The garden terrace surrounded them with its alien blossoms, its quiet light, its small pocket of living beauty carved into the heart of a warship. "You have become wiser," she said. Declan shrugged. "I have become older. That is not always the same thing." For a moment, something close to warmth returned to her eyes. That night, in the hours after Seraphine returned to her quarters, the ship carried on through the dark spaces between stars. The Third Fleet had been dispatched. The investigation continued. The noble houses whispered and calculated and waited. And in the silence of the royal chambers, a shadow moved. The assassin was good, better than good. It had bypassed 3 layers of the palace security grid, using codes that should not have existed outside the highest levels of military intelligence. It moved through the darkened corridors with the fluid precision of something that had been bred for a single purpose, wearing light-bending armor that rendered it nearly invisible to both eyes and sensors. It reached the Queen's chamber door without triggering a single alarm. The door slid open in silence. The room beyond was dark. The faint glow of starlight through the window cast long shadows across the floor. In the center of the chamber, the bed was occupied. A figure lay beneath the covers, the slow rise and fall of breathing barely visible. The assassin moved forward. 3 steps. 4. Its weapon materialized from the armor on its forearm, a thin blade of concentrated energy that hummed at a frequency just below the threshold of hearing. 5 steps. 6. It raised the blade, and Seraphine opened her eyes. She was not in the bed. She was standing in the shadow behind the door, and she had been waiting for 17 minutes. The assassin realized its mistake in the same instant that Seraphine's hand closed around its wrist. The royal bloodline energy surged through her like a white-hot current, and the assassin's light-bending armor was shattered like glass in a furnace. The figure beneath it was revealed a tall, lean Varanthi with pale skin and dead eyes dressed in the unmarked tactical gear of a professional killer. It tried to twist free. Seraphine did not let go. She redirected the blade arm downward and drove her knee into the assassin's midsection. The creature doubled over. She released the wrist, stepped back, and in one continuous motion, channeled a burst of energy through her open palm that struck the assassin in the center of its chest. The body hit the far wall and did not move again. Silence. Seraphine stood in the center of her own chambers, breathing hard, her right hand still glowing faintly with the residual energy of the kill. The assassin was dead. The entire encounter had lasted less than 8 seconds. She was unhurt. She was victorious. She was the most dangerous person on the ship, and everyone who had ever underestimated her had done so at their final cost. And she was shaking. Not from fear, not from adrenaline, from memory. Because the last time she had stood over a body she had killed with her own power, she had been 10 years old and the Arizona night had been warm, and the boy sleeping in the house nearby had never known how close death had come to both of them. She looked at her hand. The glow faded. The trembling did not. The door opened. Commander Thelen burst in with 4 guards, weapons drawn, responding to the energy spike that had finally registered on the security grid. They found their queen standing alone in a dark room with a dead assassin at her feet and an expression on her face that none of them had ever seen before. Thelen assessed the situation in 2 seconds. She barked orders. The guards secured the room, removed the body, and initiated a full security sweep of the vessel. "Your Majesty," Thelen said, her voice tight with controlled fury. The security codes used to bypass the grid. They were military grade. Level 9 clearance. Seraphine nodded slowly. She already knew. "I want every officer with level 9 access identified by morning," Seraphine said. Her voice was steady again, the mask back in place, but something behind it had cracked. "Run the codes against the 3rd Fleet deployment authorization. If someone embedded override sequences in my own military orders, I want to know who, when, and how." Thelen saluted and disappeared. Seraphine stood alone in the chamber for another minute. Then she walked to the window and pressed her forehead against the cold glass. That was how Declan found her. Thelen had woken him and brought him to the royal corridor without explanation. He arrived at the door, saw the scorch marks on the far wall, saw the guards, saw the look on Thelen's face, and understood immediately what had happened. He stepped into the chamber. He saw Seraphine standing at the window with her back to the room, her shoulders rigid, her hands pressed flat against the glass. The scorch mark on the far wall was still warm. The air smelled faintly of ozone and something else, something sharper, like the aftermath of a lightning strike. A thin crack ran through the crystalline wall where the assassin's body had impacted, a permanent reminder, etched into the structure of the ship itself. He did not ask if she was all right. He did not ask what happened. He did not offer comfort or reassurance or any of the things that well-meaning people say when they encounter someone who has just survived something terrible. He had no training for this. He had no protocol. He had nothing to offer except the one thing that had mattered to a frightened girl hiding behind a garden wall 15 years ago. He walked to the window and stood beside her, close enough that she could feel his presence, far enough that she had space. And he waited. Minutes passed. The stars moved outside the glass. Somewhere in the ship, the security sweep continued, alarms pulsed in distant corridors, and the machinery of an empire responded to the realization that someone had tried to kill its queen. Guards moved in organized patterns through the hallways. Officers shouted orders. Emergency protocols engaged throughout the vessel. The entire ship was awake now, buzzing with the urgent energy of a hive that had been disturbed. But in the royal chamber, there was only silence and starlight, and 2 people standing at a window. Seraphine did not move. Her reflection in the glass was faint, almost translucent, And Declan could see that her eyes were open, staring at something beyond the stars, beyond the ship, beyond the present moment. She was somewhere else. She was in Arizona. She was 10 years old. She was standing over a body in the dark. Then very quietly she said, "Every time I have to do that, I lose a piece of something I cannot get back." Declan said nothing. He simply stood there, present, patient, and unflinching, an anchor in still water. He understood now that this was his purpose here, not to fight her battles or solve her problems or play any role in the vast political drama unfolding around them. His purpose was simpler and harder than any of those things. His purpose was to be the one person in her life who did not need her to be strong. After a long time, Seraphine exhaled and straightened. The mask returned. The queen returned. But something in the way she looked at Declan had shifted, as though she had just confirmed something she had always suspected, but had never been able to test, that he would still be there when the worst of her was visible. She touched his arm briefly as she passed. It was the first physical contact between them since she had taken his hand to examine an insect he had caught for her behind his grandparents' house 15 years ago. It lasted less than a second. It said everything that needed to be said. By morning, Thelen's investigation had confirmed what Seraphine already feared. The security codes used by the assassin had been generated from within the Third Fleet's command infrastructure. The same fleet she had just deployed to the Tesserine corridor. The same fleet that was now moving toward a border region that, according to intercepted communications decoded in the early hours of the morning, was not actually being raided by disorganized pirates. It was a prepared ambush. Valdres had played it perfectly. He had manufactured the border crisis through his agents, knowing that Seraphine's military instincts would compel her to respond. The fleet deployment put her most loyal ships in a kill zone. If they were destroyed, the blame would fall on the Queen's judgment. If she recalled them, she would appear indecisive before the court. Either way, Valdres won. Seraphine stood in the war room aboard the Imperial vessel, surrounded by holographic star maps and the grim faces of her senior commanders. The Third Fleet was 6 hours from the Tesserine corridor. In 6 hours, 12,000 Varanthe soldiers would fly into a trap. "Your Majesty," the Fleet Admiral said carefully. "If we recall the fleet now, Valdres will use it as evidence of weakness. The noble houses will say you deployed without proper intelligence and then panicked." Seraphine stared at the star map. Her gaze traced the fleet's projected trajectory, the placement of the reported pirate bases, the narrow channels of the corridor where a fleet would be most vulnerable. She saw the trap. She saw both jaws of it, the military jaw and the political jaw designed to crush her no matter which direction she moved. And then she saw the third option. "We will not recall the fleet," she said. The Admiral blinked. "Your Majesty, the ambush." "I know about the ambush," Seraphine said calmly. She reached into the holographic map and began rearranging fleet positions with precise, deliberate movements. "We are going to let them think the trap is working. The Third Fleet will continue on its current heading. But I am transferring command authority to myself, effective immediately." The room went still. "I will personally lead the fleet into the corridor," she continued. "But we will not take the route they expect. There are 3 navigable channels through the Tesserine region. The obvious one is the widest and the most direct. That is where the ambush will be waiting. We will take the northern channel instead, come through the asteroid field at the far end, and strike the ambush force from behind before they realize we have changed course." The Admiral stared at the reconfigured map. "The northern channel," he said. "It is barely navigable. The asteroid density alone would destroy half our escort frigates. Not if we use the frigates as forward screens and route the heavy cruisers through in column formation," Seraphine replied. "I have studied this corridor. My mother's fleet used the Northern Passage during the Tesserine campaign 40 years ago. The charts still exist in the Imperial Archive." She looked at the Admiral. "I accessed them this morning." The room was silent. Then the Admiral slowly nodded. The Third Fleet changed course 4 hours later. Seraphine stood on the command bridge of the flagship, watching the stars slide past as the fleet entered the asteroid field. The northern channel was as dangerous as the Admiral had warned. Massive rocks drifted through the passage like sleeping giants, some of them the size of small cities, their surfaces scarred by impacts that predated the Varanthe Empire by millions of years. The fleet threaded between them with the careful precision of a needle pulling thread through heavy fabric. The bridge crew worked in focused silence. Officers murmured coordinates to one another. Navigation holographics projected the path ahead in real time. Each asteroid tracked and plotted each deviation calculated to the fraction of a degree. One wrong turn, one miscalculated trajectory, and a cruiser weighing several 100,000 tons would collide with a rock at velocities that would vaporize both on impact. Seraphine stood at the center of it all with her hands clasped behind her back and her eyes fixed on the holographic display. She did not pace. She did not fidget. She watched the fleet move through the asteroid field the way a surgeon watches a scalpel, with total attention and absolute control. At one point, the lead frigate reported a debris field blocking the projected path. The navigation officer turned to the Queen with visible tension. Seraphine studied the debris pattern for 3 seconds, then issued a series of course corrections that routed the entire fleet through a gap between two massive asteroids that the navigation computers had classified as too narrow. The gap was exactly wide enough. The fleet passed through without a single hull scrape. The navigation officer stared at his display for a long moment afterward. Then he looked at the Queen with an expression that suggested his definition of what was possible had just been forcibly expanded. Declan was not on the bridge. Thelen had kept him in his quarters during the military operation, which he accepted without argument. He understood that this was not his world. This was Seraphine's, and she moved through it the way a master musician moves through a symphony, with a command of complexity that made the impossible look like the only logical choice. The ambush force was waiting in the main channel exactly where Seraphine had predicted. 47 warships belonging to no official faction, crewed by Varanthi mercenaries, funded through accounts that Thelen's people would later trace to intermediaries connected to 3 of Valdris's allied noble houses. They were expecting the Third Fleet to come through the wide southern passage. They were positioned in a perfect crescent formation designed to catch the Imperial ships in a crossfire the moment they emerged from the channel. Their weapons were charged, and their crews were ready. They had been waiting for 6 hours, confident in the intelligence that told them exactly where and when their prey would arrive. Instead, the Third Fleet materialized behind them. The mercenary commander had approximately 4 seconds to understand what had happened before the first salvo hit his flagship. Seraphine gave no dramatic speeches. She issued a single command. The Imperial fleet opened fire from a position of total tactical superiority, and the ambush force designed to attack from the front found itself desperately trying to turn and face an enemy that had appeared in the one direction they had never thought to guard. The battle lasted 22 minutes. 31 of the 47 ambush ships were disabled or destroyed. The remaining 16 surrendered. Their crews were taken prisoner, and the intelligence officers who would interrogate them over the following days would find a trail of evidence that led back through shell companies and intermediary accounts to the doorstep of Lord Valdris the Nora. Not a single Imperial ship was lost. When Seraphine walked off the command bridge 8 hours after the battle, the quarters of the flagship were lined with soldiers who saluted as she passed. Word had already spread through the fleet and begun its transmission back to the Imperial court. The Queen had personally led the Third Fleet into a known ambush and turned it into a victory. She had navigated the asteroid field that the Empire's most experienced admirals had considered impassable. She had destroyed an enemy force nearly twice the size of her own escort fleet without losing a single ship. It was the kind of military triumph that reshapes political reality. By the time the fleet began its return journey, the noble houses that had been quietly supporting Valdris found themselves recalculating their positions with considerable urgency. 3 houses that had publicly questioned Seraphine's leadership in the days before the battle sent formal communications to the throne expressing their unwavering loyalty. 2 others requested private audiences. One, a minor house from the outer systems that had been vocal in its criticism, simply went quiet and stayed quiet, which in the language of Varanthi politics was the equivalent of a full retreat. The soldiers aboard the flagship told the story over and over in the mess halls and barracks, each retelling adding a layer of legend. The Queen had studied her own mother's battle charts. The Queen had piloted the fleet through an asteroid field in the dark. The Queen had given the order to fire without hesitation, without doubt, without mercy. By the time the story reached the outer colonies, Seraphine had become something more than a ruler. She had become the kind of figure that empires built monuments to. Declan was waiting on the observation deck when she returned. He looked at her for a long moment. She was still wearing the command uniform she had put on before the battle. There were faint shadows under her eyes that had not been there a day ago, and the way she moved through the doorway suggested that the adrenaline that had carried her through the engagement had finally drained away, leaving behind nothing but a bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of victory could cure. So he said, "Good day at work." Seraphine almost laughed. Then she sat down in the chair beside his and closed her eyes. For a few minutes, she was not a queen or a commander or a political strategist. She was simply exhausted. But the respite did not last. The fleet returned to the imperial court 3 days later. Seraphine's victory at the Tesserine corridor had shifted the balance of power visibly. Nobles who had avoided her gaze now bowed deeper. Officers who had whispered about weakness now spoke of her with something approaching reverence. The investigation into the communication archives was advancing, and each new piece of evidence pulled the net tighter around Valdris and his allies. A lesser enemy would have retreated. Valdris was not a lesser enemy. On the morning of the 7th day, as the court assembled for a scheduled session on trade policy, Lord Valdris requested formal address. Seraphine granted it. She sat on her throne, the pale light in her eyes steady, her posture relaxed in the way that only someone supremely confident in their own power can afford. Declan stood to the side of the chamber near the eastern gallery, leaning against the railing with his arms loosely crossed. Valdris walked to the center of the throne room. He moved slowly, deliberately, and Declan noticed something different about him today. The careful composure was still there, but beneath it was something harder, something that had stopped calculating and started gambling. "Your Majesty," Valdris began. His voice carried across the chamber with practiced resonance. "The Empire celebrates your victory at Tesserine. Your courage is beyond question. Your military acumen is proven." He paused. "Let the record reflect that I speak these words with genuine admiration." The court listened. Seraphine said nothing. Valdris continued. "However, my duty to the Empire compels me to raise a matter of law. Not politics, not opinion, law." The chamber grew very still. Article 17 of the Varanthi Sovereignty Code Valdris states that a reigning monarch shall not elevate personal attachment above the welfare of the empire. If it can be demonstrated that a sovereign's judgment has been compromised by emotional bonds to any individual, foreign or domestic, the High Council may invoke a formal tribunal to assess the sovereign's fitness to rule. The words fell into the throne room like stones dropped into deep water. Declan watched the reaction spread through the court in real time. Some nobles nodded gravely as though Valdris had given voice to concerns they had been too cautious to express themselves. Others looked alarmed, recognizing the invocation of Article 17 for what it was: not a legal proceeding, but a political weapon designed to force the Queen into an impossible choice. A few of the younger officers near the walls exchanged glances that suggested they were calculating which side of this particular conflict offered the better odds of career survival. Valdris turned slowly, looking at the assembled nobles with the practiced eye of a man who had spent decades counting votes before they were cast. "Your Majesty searched the galaxy for years to locate this human," he said, gesturing toward Declan. "She has allocated imperial resources, military escorts, and diplomatic attention to his retrieval and protection. She has housed him in the royal wing of the flagship. She has granted him access to the Queen's private quarters." Whispers erupted across the court. Declan noticed that the whispers were not uniform. Some carried genuine concern. Others carried the sharp, hungry tone of beings who sensed opportunity in the chaos. Valdris raised his voice slightly. "This is not a question of sentiment. It is a question of sovereignty. If the Queen's judgment regarding this human is driven by personal emotion rather than imperial strategy, then Article 17 applies. And the law is clear." He turned back to Seraphine. His composure was immaculate. His voice was measured and respectful, and beneath every word, like a blade concealed inside a flower arrangement, was the absolute certainty of a man who believed he had just played the winning move in a game he had been running for 15 years. "I call upon your Majesty to resolve this matter voluntarily," he said. "Return the human to his world, quietly, before the court is forced to act." The chamber held its breath. Seraphine sat motionless on the throne. Her expression revealed nothing. But Declan, standing at the edge of the room, saw what no one else could see: the faintest tension in her jaw, the slight narrowing of her eyes, not anger, recognition. She had anticipated this move, but not this soon. Valdris was not finished. "If your Majesty declines," he said then, I formally request the convening of a royal tribunal under Article 17. Let the court examine the evidence and render judgment. Silence. Total, absolute, crushing silence. Then from the ranks of the nobles, voices began to rise. Some in protest, some in support. The chamber fractured along fault lines that had existed for years, but had never been forced into the open. Declan watched it all from the eastern gallery. He watched the nobles argue. He watched Thelen's hand move to the weapon at her side. He watched Elder Oren close his eyes with the weary expression of a man who had seen too many empires tear themselves apart from the inside. And he watched Seraphine. She sat on the throne and let the storm rage. She did not interrupt. She did not defend herself. She let every voice speak, let every position reveal itself, let the court show her exactly who stood where. Then she raised one hand. The room fell silent instantly. The tribunal will be granted, she said. Shock rippled through the chamber. Thelen's head snapped toward the throne. Even Valdris looked momentarily surprised. I will answer Article 17 before the full court, Seraphine continued. Her voice was calm, measured, and absolutely certain. Every question will be addressed. Every piece of evidence will be examined. And when it is finished, there will be no further doubt about the nature of my judgment or the future of this empire. She looked at Valdris. Schedule the tribunal for 3 days from now. I trust that is sufficient time for you to prepare your case, Lord Valdris. It was a challenge delivered with the quiet precision of someone who was not defending a position, but selecting the battlefield for a war she intended to win. Valdris bowed. It will be sufficient, Your Majesty. The court dispersed in fragments. The political landscape of the empire had shifted again, and every noble house was recalculating its survival odds for the third time in a week. That evening, Declan found Seraphine in the war room. She was alone, standing before the holographic star map, with her hands clasped behind her back, staring at the web of star systems that comprised her empire, as though searching for an answer hidden among the light. The map cast pale blue shadows across her features, and in its glow, she looked less like a queen and more like a navigator trying to find her way through a storm that had no visible end. He stood in the doorway for a moment. He thought about the apartment in Prescott, the small desk where he worked remotely processing invoices for a company whose name he sometimes forgot. The silence of evenings spent alone watching television. He did not care about eating food he did not taste. He thought about the strange, impossible, terrifying fact that in the span of a single week, he had seen more purpose and more pain and more genuine human, or rather genuine feeling, than he had experienced in 25 years on Earth. Then he walked in. You should send me back, he said. Seraphine did not turn around. I am serious, Declan continued. His voice was quiet, stripped of its usual dry humor. The jacket that he had been wearing since the night of his abduction felt suddenly heavy on his shoulders, as though it carried the weight of everything he was about to give up. Valdris is using me as a weapon against you. If I am gone, he loses his leverage. The tribunal becomes meaningless. You keep your throne and your empire keeps its queen. He paused. That matters more than whatever this is. Seraphine was silent for a long moment. The holographic stars cast faint light across her face. When she finally turned to look at him, her expression held something Declan had not seen before. Not sadness, not determination. Something older than both. Something that looked like the weariness of a woman who had spent her entire life making impossible choices and had just been presented with one more. You think I brought you here because I am sentimental, she said. Declan paused. Didn't you? Seraphine looked at him the way she had looked at the star map, as though he was a problem she had already solved but could not yet explain. No, she said quietly, but not for the reason you think. She turned back to the stars. In 3 days, she said, the court will understand, and so will you. Declan stood there for a longer time watching the queen of an alien empire stare into the light of 100 billion stars with the expression of someone who had been playing a game that no one else knew existed. And he felt something he had not expected. Not fear, not confusion, trust. Whatever Seraphine was planning, whatever she had been building toward, since the moment she sent her soldiers to retrieve a nobody from Prescott, Arizona, she had not shown her full hand to anyone. Not to the court, not to Valdris, not even to him. He left the war room without another word. Behind him, Seraphine stood alone among the stars. The familiar glow behind her eyes brightened in the darkness. 3 days. The tribunal convened on the third day, and the throne room had never been so full. Every noble house in the empire had sent representatives. They filled the tiered balconies that rose along the chamber walls like the interior of some vast amphitheater carved from living crystal. The main floor was packed with senior officers, diplomats, planetary governors, and members of the High Council who had traveled from distant star systems specifically for this moment. Holographic projectors carried the proceedings to every inhabited world in the Varanthi Empire. Billions watched. On mining colonies at the edge of explored space, workers paused their shifts to gather around communal screens. On agricultural worlds that had never seen a Varanthi noble in person, farmers stood in fields and watched the proceedings projected against the evening sky. On military outposts along contested borders, soldiers watched in mess halls with the particular intensity of people who understood that the outcome of this tribunal would determine whether the empire they served would hold together or break apart. The atmosphere in the throne room was electric. Every conversation in the chamber was conducted in whispers, as though speaking at full volume might shatter something fragile and invisible that hung in the air. The light currents flowing through the walls seemed brighter than usual, as though the ship itself understood the significance of what was about to occur. Declan stood near the eastern gallery, flanked by Commander Thelen and two of her most trusted guards. He wore the same jacket he had arrived in, now slightly creased from a week aboard an alien warship. He looked by any objective measure completely out of place. A single ordinary human standing at the edge of a galactic tribunal that would determine the fate of an empire. He was calm. He did not fully understand why, but he was calm. Perhaps it was because he had spent the last 3 days watching Seraphine prepare for this moment with the quiet, deliberate focus of someone who had already played the game to its end in her mind and was now simply waiting for reality to catch up. She had not told him what she planned. She had not explained her strategy, but the way she carried herself, the steadiness in her eyes, the absolute absence of doubt in her posture, all of it told Declan that whatever was about to happen in this chamber, Seraphine had already won. The court just did not know it yet. Seraphine entered the chamber without escort. That detail alone sent a tremor through the assembled court. The queen of the Varanthi Empire walked into her own tribunal alone, wearing not the ceremonial armor of a monarch, but the simple dark clothing she wore in private. No crown, no royal insignia, no visible weapon. No entourage of advisors or guards or attendants. She moved through the parting crowd with the unhurried certainty of someone who had already decided how this day would end. The nobles watched her pass with expressions that ranged from admiration to bewilderment. A queen walking unprotected into a legal proceeding designed to unseat her was either an act of supreme confidence or supreme foolishness, and the court had not yet decided which. Declan watched her from the gallery and saw neither confidence nor foolishness. He saw something simpler. He saw a woman who had decided to face her accusers as herself, not as a title or a symbol or a position of power, but as the person she actually was. It was the same thing she had done behind a garden wall in Arizona 15 years ago when she had looked at a strange boy and decided to trust him with the truth of what she was. She did not sit on the throne. Instead, she walked to the center of the chamber floor and stood there at the same level as every other person in the room. A murmur passed through the court like wind disturbing the surface of still water. Several nobles exchanged glances. The symbolism was impossible to miss. The queen of the empire was standing among them, not above them, and by doing so she was saying something about the kind of ruler she was that no speech could have communicated more effectively. Lord Valdres stood on the opposite side of the chamber. He was dressed in his finest robes, golden thread shimmering against dark fabric. The ridges along his temples caught the light. He looked composed, confident, and prepared. Behind him, arranged in careful formation, stood the representatives of 11 noble houses that had publicly aligned with his position. Elder Oren sat in the gallery reserved for senior advisors. His pale blue skin looked almost translucent under the chamber lights, but his eyes were sharp and alert. He watched Seraphine with an expression that Declan could not quite read, something between pride and grief. The chief arbiter of the High Council, a tall female Varanthi with ceremonial markings etched across her collarbone, called the tribunal to order. Her voice was formal and precise. This tribunal convenes under Article 17 of the Varanthi Sovereignty Code. The matter before the court is whether the reigning sovereign has permitted personal attachment to compromise her judgment in matters of imperial governance. Lord Valdres Thenora has brought the petition. The sovereign has accepted the tribunal voluntarily. Both parties will present their cases. The court will render judgment. She turned to Valdres. Lord Valdres, you may begin. Valdres stepped forward. He moved with the measured grace of a man who had spent decades perfecting the art of political performance. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. Distinguished members of the court, he began. I do not question the Queen's courage. Her victory at Tesserine proved beyond doubt that she possesses the military instincts of a born commander. I do not question her intelligence. Her governance has brought stability and prosperity to the empire in ways that history will remember with gratitude. He paused, letting the praise settle. Then his voice shifted. What I question is the judgment of a sovereign who spent 5 years in considerable imperial resources searching the galaxy for a single human male from a primitive world. What I question is the decision to bring that individual into the heart of the imperial court, to house him in the royal wing, and to grant him access that is denied to members of the High Council itself. These are not the actions of a ruler guided by strategy. These are the actions of a woman guided by emotion. He gestured toward Declan without looking at him. This human has no military value, no political value, no diplomatic standing, no expertise in any field relevant to imperial governance. He is by every measurable standard irrelevant to the empire. And yet the Queen has placed him at the center of a political crisis that now threatens to fracture the unity of the noble houses. Valdres turned to face Seraphine directly. I bear no malice toward the human. I bear no malice toward the Queen. But the law exists to protect the empire from the vulnerabilities of any single individual, even a sovereign. Article 17 is clear. If personal attachment has compromised the sovereign's judgment, the court must act. He stepped back. The chamber was silent. Several nobles nodded. Others watched Seraphine with expressions ranging from sympathy to cold calculation. The chief arbiter turned to the throne. Your Majesty, you may respond. Seraphine stood in the center of the chamber floor. Alone, unarmored, surrounded by the most powerful beings in the galaxy, every one of them waiting to hear her defend herself against the charge that her heart had made her unfit to rule. She did not defend herself. Lord Valdres asked the court to believe that I brought Declan Hollis to this empire because of sentiment, she said. Her voice was calm, not loud, not soft, but tuned to a frequency that seemed to reach every corner of the enormous chamber without effort. He is correct that I searched for this human for years. He is correct that I allocated resources to find him. He is correct that I granted him access that few in this empire possess. She paused. But Lord Valdres has made an error that I suspect he will regret. He has assumed that because something began with emotion, it cannot also serve a purpose. The chamber shifted. Attention sharpened. Seraphine began to walk slowly across the floor, not pacing nervously, but moving with the deliberate rhythm of someone who was building something that the audience could not yet see. 15 years ago, she said, I was a child hiding on Earth. I had no power, no allies, no future. The empire was tearing itself apart, and every faction that had hunted my family believed I was already dead. The only person who showed me kindness during that time was a 10-year-old human boy who did not know what I was and did not care. He shared his food with me. He taught me the names of insects and the sound of rain. And one evening, sitting under a tree, he said something that I have never forgotten. She stopped walking. Her luminous gaze moved across the court. He said that if people kept fighting over who deserved power, they would eventually destroy everything they were trying to rule. Silence. He was 10. Seraphine continued. He did not understand politics. He did not understand war. He understood something simpler and something far more difficult. That the purpose of power is not to hold it. It is to use it in a way that makes holding it unnecessary. She turned to face the full court. When I returned to this empire, she said I was 15 years old. My family was dead. The throne was empty. Every noble house wanted to control me. Every general wanted to use me. Every faction saw me as a piece to be positioned on their board. They expected me to rule through fear as my predecessors had done. They expected me to punish my enemies, consolidate through force, and govern through the threat of violence. Her voice grew stronger. I chose a different path. Every major decision I have made as queen was built on the principle that a boy from Arizona articulated under a mesquite tree when he was 10 years old. That kindness is not weakness. That trust is not naivety. That you can hold power without letting it consume you. She began to list them, not as statistics, but as stories. The three rebel worlds of the Tesserine Rim, she said, who had been at war with the Empire for 40 years before I took the throne. Every advisor told me to crush them, to send the fleet and burn their defenses and force them into submission the way my grandfather had done to their parents. Instead, I sent a single diplomatic vessel with an offer of amnesty, trade access, and self-governance within the imperial framework. The noble houses called me naive. The military called me weak. Those three worlds have been at peace for 12 years. They now contribute more to the imperial economy than they ever cost us in war. The lives saved by that single decision number approximately 400,000. She turned to another section of the court. The trade alliance with the Korath systems, she continued. Former enemies who had fought against us during the Civil War. Convention demanded punishment, reparations, occupation. Instead, I offered partnership, equal terms, shared technology. The Korath alliance now generates more wealth for the empire in a single year than the previous century of forced tribute produced in total. Her voice grew quieter but no less powerful. And the amnesty, she said. The families of those who had taken up arms against the crown during the Civil War. Thousands of them. Convention demanded exons, imprisonment, execution of the worst offenders. I offered them citizenship, full rights, a place in the empire they had tried to destroy. My advisors told me I was building an army of enemies inside my own borders. Instead, I built a generation of citizens who understood that the empire they lived in was worth preserving because it had been willing to forgive. She paused and let the silence hold. Each of these decisions was questioned at the time. Each was called sentimental, naive, weak. And each decision had proven to be correct. The empire you see today, Seraphine said, is the most stable it has been in 200 years. Not because I am the strongest ruler, not because I am the most ruthless, because I chose to govern with something other than fear. And the seed of that choice was planted by the human standing in this room. She looked at Declan, not with the warmth of the garden terrace or the exhaustion of the war room, with something harder and clearer. The look of someone presenting their most important piece of evidence. I did not bring him here because I am sentimental, she said. I brought him here because he is living proof that the philosophy which built this empire did not come from political calculation. It came from the simple kindness of an ordinary person. A boy who shared his lunch with a stranger because she was hungry. A child who taught an alien princess that kindness did not require a reason. That compassion was not a strategy. That the measure of a civilization is not in how it treats its powerful, but in how it treats those who have nothing to offer in return. She let those words settle into the enormous chamber like dust falling through a shaft of light. And if this court cannot see the value in that, she said, then the empire has already lost something far more important than a tribunal. The chamber was utterly still. Then Seraphine turned to face Valdris directly. And now she said, her voice dropping to a register that carried a different kind of weight entirely. Well, let us discuss the real reason this tribunal was called. Valdris's expression flickered. Something moved behind the composure. Seraphine raised her hand. Commander Thelen. Thelen stepped forward from the eastern gallery. She carried a crystalline data core that pulsed with pale blue light. She placed it on the central display platform, and a holographic interface bloomed above it, filling the air with cascading streams of data. 6 days ago, Seraphine said an assassin infiltrated my personal chambers using military-grade security codes with level 9 clearance. I killed the assassin myself. The codes were traced to the 3rd Fleet's command infrastructure, the same fleet I had deployed to the Tesserine corridor on intelligence that, as we now know, was fabricated to lure my ships into an ambush. The court listened with growing tension. Seraphine continued. The investigation ordered after Elder Orin's testimony in this chamber has now produced results. Commander Thelen will present them. Thelen activated the data core. Holographic records filled the air above the chamber floor. Communication logs, financial transactions, encrypted messages decoded through months of painstaking analysis. The evidence was methodical, layered, and devastating. Thelon's voice was flat and precise as she walked the court through it. 15 years ago, on the night the royal family was assassinated, the Imperial Communication Array received 4 distress signals from the Queen's Guardian. All 4 were intercepted and blocked. The blocking codes originated from a terminal in the High Council's private communications center. Access logs show that terminal was used exclusively by one council member during that period. She paused. Lord Valdres Thenora. The chamber erupted, shouts, denials, gasps of shock that echoed off the crystalline walls and multiplied into a wall of sound. Valdres's allied nobles looked at each other with expressions that shifted rapidly from loyalty to panic. Valdres raised his voice above the chaos. Fabricated. This is fabricated evidence manufactured by a queen desperate to deflect from her own failures of judgment. Thelon continued as though he had not spoken. Additionally, financial records recovered from intermediary accounts on 3 neutral worlds show a pattern of payments originating from accounts controlled by Lord Valdres's household. These payments were directed to the mercenary fleet that ambushed the Third Fleet in the Tesserine corridor. The payment trail has been verified by independent auditors from 4 allied systems. She looked at Valdres, and the assassin who entered the Queen's chamber 6 days ago was equipped with a neural comm device. Before the device was destroyed, our technicians recovered a partial signal trace. The signal originated from this vessel, from quarters assigned to Lord Valdres's personal staff. The throne room fell into a silence so deep that it seemed to swallow light. Valdres stood alone in the center of the storm. The nobles who had backed him were pulling away physically, stepping back, as though proximity to him had suddenly become dangerous. His face was white, not with shame, with the particular fury of a man who has just realized that every move he made in the last week was anticipated, cataloged, and used against him. Seraphine watched him with a gaze that held no triumph, no satisfaction, only the cold, clear-eyed focus of a queen who had spent her entire reign preparing for this moment. "You called this tribunal," she said quietly, "because you believed I was vulnerable. You believed that my attachment to a human was a weakness you could exploit. You manufactured a border crisis to expose my military judgment. You sent an assassin to kill me in my sleep. And when all of that failed, you invoked the law itself as a weapon." She stepped closer to him. The court held its breath. "But you made one mistake, Lord Valdres. You assumed that because I chose kindness, I was incapable of strategy. You confused mercy with weakness. And you underestimated how long I have been watching you." Valdres stared at her, his mouth open, closed. "The formal investigation I ordered after Oren's testimony was not the beginning of my inquiry," Seraphine said. "It was the end. I have been building this case since the day I took the throne. Every piece of evidence Commander Thelon just presented has been verified, cross-referenced, and secured in archives on 4 separate worlds. I gave you the freedom to act because I knew that a guilty man who believes he is winning will always reach too far." She turned to the court. "This tribunal was called to examine whether my judgment was compromised by personal attachment. The evidence before you shows that every action I took regarding Declan Hollis was conducted alongside a systematic investigation into the greatest act of treason in this empire's history. I did not lose focus. I did not let emotion blind me. I held 2 campaigns simultaneously, one in the open and one in the shadows, and I won both." She looked at the chief arbiter. "I believe the court has its answer." The silence that followed lasted 7 full seconds. Then the chief arbiter spoke. "The tribunal finds no grounds for action under Article 17. The petition is dismissed." The chamber erupted. But this time the sound was different. It was not the fractured noise of political conflict. It was something closer to awe. Valdres broke. He lunged not toward Seraphine, but toward the nearest exit, shouting orders into a wrist communicator. His remaining loyalists, a handful of soldiers embedded in the palace guard, materialized from their positions and formed a protective cordon around him. Weapons powered up. The throne room descended into chaos. Thelon moved before anyone else. She had positioned her guards throughout the chamber hours before the tribunal began, and now they stepped forward from every doorway, every balcony, every corridor leading out of the throne room. The exit sealed. The palace entered lockdown. Valdres found himself surrounded. His soldiers outnumbered and cut off. looked at each other with the hollow recognition of men who had just realized they were standing on the wrong side of history. One by one, they began to lower their weapons. One dropped his entirely, the clatter of it against the crystalline floor echoing through the silent chamber. But Valdris was not finished. He had not survived 15 years of deception, had not orchestrated the murder of a royal family and the manipulation of an empire by being the kind of man who surrendered when the odds turned against him. He pulled a device from his robes and activated it. A high-pitched tone filled the chamber, and the holographic displays flickered and died. "If I am taken," he snarled, his voice raw with a desperation that stripped away every layer of political composure he had ever worn. "The charges on the reactor core of this vessel will detonate. I embedded them months ago. You will not take me alive and keep this ship intact." A technician near Thelen checked her scanner and whispered urgently, the blood draining from her face. He used his maintenance personnel. They were embedded in the engineering core before the Queen even took the throne. "We have been finding their access signatures throughout the lower decks for weeks. The charges are real. At least 4 devices on the primary reactor housing." The court froze. Fear rippled through the chamber like a physical wave. Nobles scrambled backward, their composure finally shattering under the weight of genuine mortal terror. Guards raised weapons they suddenly did not dare to fire. The holographic projectors were down, but every being in the room understood that billions of Varanthi across the Empire were now watching through secondary feeds, watching to see how this ended. Seraphine did not move. She stood exactly where she was in the center of the chamber floor and looked at the man who had murdered her family, hunted her across the galaxy, and spent 15 years trying to destroy everything she had built. She looked at him, and she was not afraid. She walked toward him. Thelen shouted a warning. Guards surged forward. Seraphine raised one hand without looking back, and every soldier in the room stopped, as though the air itself had turned solid. She walked until she stood directly in front of Valdris, close enough to touch, close enough that if the charges were real, they would both die in the same instant. The entire court could see her now standing unarmed before a desperate traitor with a detonator in his hand, and the image of it would burn itself into the collective memory of the Varanthi Empire for generations to come. Valdris stared at her. His hand trembled on the device. Sweat glistened on his pale skin. Up close, Declan could see that the man was terrified. Not of death, of something worse. Of the realization that he had spent 15 years building a version of reality that was now collapsing around him, and that the woman standing before him, the child he had once tried to murder, had not only survived, but had surpassed every limitation he had ever tried to place on her. "You killed my parents," Seraphine said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the frozen silence of the tribunal chamber, it reached every ear. Every corner, every balcony, every holographic feed still broadcasting to the far reaches of the Empire. "You murdered my mother while she slept. You hunted my father through the corridors of his own palace. You sent assassins after a child. You blocked the distress signals that could have saved them. And then you stood in this court for 15 years and pretended to serve the crown you helped to empty." She let each sentence land separately, like stones placed one by one on a scale. Valdris's breathing was ragged. His finger hovered over the detonation switch. The muscles in his forearm twitched. Behind him, his last remaining soldiers had surrendered. He was alone. He was cornered. He was a man standing at the end of a road that he had built himself, and there was nowhere left to go. Seraphine looked into his eyes, not with hatred, not with triumph, with something that Valdris clearly did not understand, something that confused him far more than any military maneuver or political trap ever could. "My parents would not want more blood spilled in their name," she said, "and I will not become the thing you tried to make me. Not for vengeance, not for justice, not even for them." She reached out and placed her hand over his, gently, the way you might take the hand of a frightened child. Valdris stared at her hand on his. Something cracked behind his eyes. Not defiance. Something deeper. Something that had held him together for 15 years and was now under the weight of a gesture he had never anticipated and could not defend against falling apart. "Let it go," Seraphine said. For 10 seconds, the fate of the Empire balanced on the trembling hand of a traitor. Then Valdris's fingers loosened. The device slipped from his grip. Thelen caught it before it hit the floor. Guards surged in and restrained him, pulling him back from the Queen. Technicians scrambled to locate and disarm whatever charges he had placed in the lower decks. Valdres was dragged from the chamber. He did not struggle. He did not speak. He stared at Seraphine as the guards pulled him away, and on his face was the expression of a man who had just been defeated by the one weapon he had never thought to guard against. Mercy. He had prepared for every contingency. He had planned for military force, for political maneuvering, for legal challenges, for assassination, for betrayal. He had built redundancies into his schemes and escape routes, into his plans and fail-safes, into his fail-safes. But he had never in 15 years of calculating every possible outcome considered the possibility that the woman whose family he had destroyed would simply walk up to him and take his hand and tell him that she would not become what he had tried to make her. It was the one scenario he had never modeled, the one variable he had never accounted for, and it had undone him completely. The doors closed behind him. The sound echoed through the chamber one final time, and then he was gone. The chamber was still for a long time after that. Then Elder Oren stepped forward. The old noble walked slowly to the center of the floor. His joints ached. His eyes were dim. He had served 3 generations of the royal family and watched 2 of them fall. He stopped before Seraphine and lowered himself to one knee with the careful, deliberate movement of a man performing an act he considered sacred. "The Queen speaks truth," he said. His voice was thin but steady. "She has always spoken truth." Behind him another noble knelt, then another, then a dozen more. The sound of it moved through the chamber like a slow tide, the quiet shifting of fabric and armor, as hundreds of alien nobles lowered themselves, not because they were commanded to, but because they had just witnessed something they did not fully understand but could not deny. Not all of them knelt. Some stood rigid, uncertain, watching with the wary eyes of beings who had survived too many regime changes to commit easily. But the tide had turned, and even those who remained standing knew that the empire they would wake up to tomorrow would be different from the one they had known yesterday. Declan watched from the gallery. He was not a political strategist. He was not a military commander. He was not a diplomat or a noble or anyone of consequence in the vast machinery of an empire that spanned a significant portion of the galaxy. He was an office worker from Prescott, Arizona, who had spent most of his adult life feeling like the world had forgotten to assign him a purpose. But standing there watching a queen who had learned the meaning of mercy from a boy who once shared his lunch with a stranger, he understood something that he suspected many of the alien nobles kneeling before Seraphine did not yet grasp. That what they had just witnessed was not a political victory. It was not a military triumph. It was the rarest and most dangerous thing in the universe, a person choosing to be kind when every rational argument, every strategic calculation, every instinct of self-preservation demanded otherwise. And he understood with a quiet certainty that settled into his chest like a stone finding the bottom of a deep, still lake that this was why Seraphine had brought him here. Not because he was special, not because he had power or knowledge or anything that the Varanthi Empire could use, but because he was the proof, the living, breathing, bewildered proof that kindness could start anywhere and anyone and change everything. Seraphine stood in the center of it all. She looked tired. She looked like someone who had carried an unbearable weight for 15 years and had just set it down, not because the weight had disappeared, but because she had finally become strong enough to let it go. She raised her voice one final time. "Let it be known across the empire," she declared, "that humanity will no longer be considered an insignificant species. From this day forward, Earth will be recognized as a protected world under the Imperial Alliance. Its people will be afforded the full rights and protections granted to any allied civilization." Shock rippled through the court, then silence, then slowly acceptance. She looked at Declan, who stood in the eastern gallery with one hand resting on the back of the empty chair beside him, and an expression on his face that was somewhere between stunned and deeply moved. "You once shared your world with a stranger," she said. The light in her expression softened in a way that the court would remember and debate for generations. "Now my empire will do the same." The tribunal ended. The noble houses dispersed. The holographic projectors carried the Queen's declaration to every inhabited world in the Varanthi Empire, and on 100 planets beings who had never heard of Earth looked up the small blue world in their star charts and wondered what it was about such a place that could change the course of an empire. Hours later, when the throne room had emptied and the corridors had grown quiet, and the last whispers of the most extraordinary day in the history of the Varanthi Empire had faded into the deep, steady hum of the ship. Declan found Seraphine in a place he had not expected. She was standing in the garden terrace, surrounded by the bioluminescent flowers that had become their accidental meeting place over the past week. The formal clothing was gone, replaced by the simple dark garment she wore in private. She was touching one of the translucent blossoms with her fingertip, watching it pulse brighter at her touch. And in that small, quiet gesture, she looked more like the girl from his memory than she had at any other moment since he had arrived on this ship. Not a queen, not a warrior, not a politician, a person. Tired, relieved, uncertain of what came next, and grateful to be alive. He walked in and stood beside her. The flowers glowed around them in slow, gentle rhythms. The observation window at the far end of the terrace showed the galaxy spread out in its full, silent majesty. And for the first time since Declan had been pulled from his apartment in Prescott, the stars outside did not look alien to him. They looked like home. Not Earth, not Arizona, but the kind of home you find when you stop looking for the place you came from and start looking for the place where you belong. For a while, neither of them spoke. The alien flowers breathed their gentle light around them. Somewhere far below, the Imperial vessel hummed with the quiet energy of a civilization that had just changed direction. So Declan said, "Does this mean I am allowed to go home at some point?" Seraphine looked at him. "Do you wish to?" Declan considered the question. He thought about his apartment in Prescott, the leftover pasta growing cold in the microwave, the baseball game he had not cared about and would never find out who won, the 25 years of quiet, unremarkable life that had preceded the moment when someone from his childhood reached across the galaxy and pulled him into a story he had never imagined. Then he looked back at the girl he had once shared apples with under a mesquite tree in the Arizona desert. The girl who had grown into a queen, the queen who had just dismantled the man who killed her family, saved her empire from civil war, and declared an entire planet protected, and who was now standing in a garden touching alien flowers with the careful wonder of someone who still remembered what it felt like to see something beautiful for the very first time. "Maybe after we finish catching up," he said. Seraphine smiled. It was the same smile from 15 years ago, small and uncertain and real. She let the flower go and turned to face the wide observation window at the far end of the terrace. Through it, the galaxy spread in every direction, vast and bright, and impossibly full of things that neither of them had yet seen. "There is something else," she said. Her voice held something new now. Not the authority of a queen or the vulnerability of a survivor, but something steady and forward-looking, like the first note of a song that had not yet been written. Declan glanced at her. Seraphine pointed toward the far edge of the visible sky, where the familiar scatter of stars gave way to a region of space that pulsed with a faint, irregular light. Not a nebula, not a star cluster. Something else entirely. "The Varanthi Empire is not the only civilization out there," she said. "We have always known this. But for the last 2 years, our deep-range sensors have been detecting signals from beyond the galactic rim. Organized signals, structured. The kind of transmissions that only come from a civilization that has existed for a very long time." Declan stared at the distant light. Friendly signals. Seraphine did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice was careful, unknown. "But the signal strength suggests a level of technological development that exceeds ours significantly, and they are getting closer." She turned to face him. "I have kept peace in this empire for 15 years. But what is coming next will require more than one empire. It will require an alliance between species, between worlds that have never spoken to each other, between civilizations that have every reason to distrust one another." She held his gaze. An ordinary man from Prescott, Arizona, and the queen of the most powerful empire in the known galaxy, standing side by side in a garden of alien light. "You think humans can be part of that," Declan said. Seraphine smiled again. That same small, real, certain smile. "A human boy once saved a future queen with 3 apples and a sentence about kindness," she said. "I think your species has earned the chance to prove what it is capable of." Declan looked at her for a long moment. Then he leaned back against the terrace railing and looked out at the stars. "I am going to need a bigger jacket," he said. Seraphine laughed, quietly, genuinely. The kind of laugh that belonged not to a queen but to a girl who had once sat under a mesquite tree in Arizona and learned that the universe contained people who would be kind for no reason at all. Outside the observation window, the empire breathed. The galaxy turned. The bioluminescent flowers in the garden terrace pulsed gently in their quiet rhythms, small points of living light in the vast darkness, no different in principle from the stars themselves. And at the far edge of the sky, beyond the reach of any empire yet built, the unfamiliar light pulsed steadily onward, patient and vast, carrying with it the promise of something that neither war, nor fear, nor the slow forgetting of time could prevent. Whatever came next, they would not face it alone.